Well, hello everyone. Today I'd like to show you a beautiful game, positional, strategic, and even tactical, that was played just a few days ago at the tournament in Tashkent, the capital of Uzbekistan. So the player with white is Shamsidin Vokhivov, and he's facing the French player Maxime Lagarde. Let's take a look. Vokhivov starts with the pawn to e4, and Maxime Lagarde chooses the French defense. He plays e6, d4, then the push to d5. The pawn on e6 is there for that purpose, to support the d5 push. Knight to c3, protecting the pawn on e4, and bishop to b4. The pin, which ultimately threatens to capture on e4. That's why white here advances the pawn to e5. So the center closes up. The play naturally shifts to the wings, and Maxime Lagarde plays c5. Bishop to d2, freeing the knight. Knight to e7, a3, attacking the bishop, and there's an exchange. Bishop takes, and it's an exchange, which is important to understand. From this point on, Vokhivov, playing white, has the only dark squared bishop. He has the bishop pair, but in reality, when we talk about the bishop pair, we're mainly referring to the play with the bishop that the opponent doesn't have. In this case, the dark squared bishop. So Vokhivov will have to look for ways to fight on the dark squares. And we'll see during this game how he tries to go about it. He has to fight on the dark squares, but at the same time prevent Maxime Lagarde from developing play on the light squares, because Maxime Lagarde may not have a dark squared bishop, but as a result he has an extra piece to play on the light squares. And right away Maxime Lagarde plays b6. He sets up the pawn structure on the dark square and frees his light squared bishop. His idea is to be able to play bishop a6 and break the pair of bishops, eliminating white's light squared bishop. h4 is played by Vokhivov. This pawn move might go a bit unnoticed, or maybe it's hard to understand. In reality, h4 is played in order to then push h5, then h6 to attack the g7 pawn. Because if the g7 pawn is no longer there, the defenses on the dark squares on the king side will be weakened. That will allow, for example, the bishop, if the g7 pawn is exchanged or pushed to g6, to find some very nice diagonals and ways to infiltrate on the dark squares. And if black blocks the h-pawn, we'll later understand the point of this h5 advance. Let's take a look. Bishop a6 is played, so the exchange of the bishops. Bishop takes, knight takes. h5, and precisely Maxime Lagarde blocks by playing h6. So why did white play h4, h5 if black simply plays h6 to block? Well, it's to create a lever on g5. Now Vokhivov plays queen e2. He attacks the knight on a6, and this lever on g5, I will talk about it right after. So black takes on d4 to counterattack on the bishop. The bishop takes knight c5, knight f3. And now black will not do kingside castling because precisely they fear the lever in g5. If black does kingside castling, then white can send g4 the white king. For now he is in the center, but the center is blocked. So there is no direct counterattack on him, and he could very well do queenside castling. And the idea is to support the push to g5 to attack the h6 pawn, to open the g file for the benefit of the white rooks, and ultimately to the detriment of the safety of the black king. Why in this position black not castling kingside? Instead, black plays queen to d7 to prepare queenside castling. In fact, both players do queenside castling. Now Vokhivov plays b3. He gives his bishop a retreat square on b2 to allow the knight to go to d4. And on top of that, he's going to set up a pawn structure on white squares with a2, b3, and soon a4, simply to deprive the black knights of white squares. The king moves to b7. Bishop to b2, the rook comes to c8, so black opens up play on the file. King to b1, knight to f5. g4 pushes the knight onto a white square because the white knight wants to come to d4 without being exchanged. And why doesn't he want to be exchanged when he comes to d4? It's because he wants to threaten entry on b5, then the dark square d6. And so Vokhivov's idea is to provoke black into playing the pawn to a6. And that is not an insignificant move. In fact, here Maxime Lagarde plays a6, but this push to a6 is a weakening of the black squares. It weakens the b6 pawn. Now, you might say maybe that's not critical. Well, actually, it will be absolutely critical. This weakening of the b6 pawn Given that white has the only dark squared bishop, the fact that the b6 pawn is weakened near the black king could cost black later in the game. That's what we're going to see. Queen to e3 is played. Rook to c7. Here, Maxime Lagarde is preparing to double the rooks on the semi-open file, which is completely normal. The knight is deprived of the e4 square, and there's still this structure on the white squares. Knight c6. The knight retreats to e2, knight a5. And you can see how Maxime Lagarde is luring Vokhivov. Maxime Lagarde, he wants the pawn to come to b4. Why? To weaken the white squares. Of course, the white pawn isn't going to come to b4 to make the fork, because the fork in reality doesn't work. If you play b4, you give up control of the white square c4 while attacking the queen. And then the knight a5 will be able to get to the a4 square. And finally, the knights have two very beautiful squares. That's why white must above all preserve their pawn structure on a white square. And now white plays g5, they come to attack the pawn on h6. Capture on g5, queen takes, attacking the pawn on g7, so rook to h7. And now knight to c3. But why didn't they play b4 earlier? If they had played b4 right away, this time the black knight can't come to c4 to attack the queen, but black could play knight to a4. And if we take, then queen to b5 threatens checkmate. With the capture of the bishop, the queen could come back, but the black queen can also take the knight on e2. And in the end, black gets their piece back by destroying the white king's shelter. That's why Vokhivov isn't going to play b4 right away. He first plays what c3 to play b4 afterwards and deprive the black knight of the a4 square. And Maxime Lagarde, he plays queen c6. He once again allows the b4 push in order to counterattack on the pawn on c2. Because if you play b4 right away, then knight f4, and after knight takes, you take on c2 with check. And after this check, the king moves and there will be knight c4, threatening the bishop, still attacking with the knight. And that's very dangerous for white. That's why Vokhivov still isn't going to play b4. He understands that there's a problem on the file. With the counterattack from the c2 pawn, so he plays rook h2. Black plays knight d7. Now there was the threat of the fork on b4, which could have worked. f4 is played, maybe with the idea of playing f5. Black won't be able to take, otherwise white will take the d5 pawn with an attack. The rook, and still the defense of the c2 pawn with the rook, this lateral defense. f5 is played, en passant, knight recaptures, h6. The idea is to destroy g7, which protects the knight, but the knight comes to e4, there's an exchange on e4, and then black plays rook takes h6. They don't recapture the knight right away, because if the rook comes to take the rook, there will be the threat of entering on c2. That's why white plays rook to g2. They still keep the protection of the c2 pawn. That's very important. Now, Maxime Lagarde recaptures. And the bishop comes to e5 to attack the rook on c7. And the rook can't stay on the file with the pressure from the c2 pawn, because there's the threat of taking on g7. If the rook comes to c8, we take on g7 with check and attack the rook. But already you can notice that the color play is won by Vokhivov. The dark square's bishop is very active. The g7 pawn is very fragile. We will soon see that the b6 pawn, the last pawn, protecting the dark squares around the black king's shelter, will also fall victim to an attack. While the black knight, when fighting against a dark squared bishop, should try to find play on the light squares. But for now, this structure of pawns holds the white squares. As long as the pawn is on b3, the knight cannot approach c4. So white must not move either the c2 pawn nor the b3 pawn. Black play rook f7. Rook d6, always the black squares. Queen b5 f4. The pawn structure is on a white square and the pieces attack on a black square. So of course there could be a check, but black will play first. Rook h1 check, king a2. Then queen f1 with this threat of entering b1. The problem after queen b1 is that there can be king a3 and the bishop still controls the a1 square. So there is not really an attack of checkmate. And now I will let you think. What do you suggest? You can pause the video to find the winning move for white. Here. So there are several winning moves. We can play queen to d8. It's very effective. A new dark square is attacked on b6. Remember the advance of the a7 pawn to a6. We talked about it earlier. Not only is the b6 pawn weak, but it also deprives the king of an escape on a white square. This attack on the b6 pawn after queen d8 is ultimately fatal for black. But here, Vokhivov played differently. He sacrificed his rook on b6. It's just as effective and maybe even prettier. Maxime Lagarde didn't take. He understood that he shouldn't take. He plays king a7, but even by not taking, it won't work. But let's see what happens if he does take. Queen d8 check, king b7. Queen b8 check, king c6, queen c8. The rook can't come because of queen takes. The bishop is there, so king d5. And here, after c4, there could perhaps be several more sacrifices. It's rather rook d2 because the king is deprived of any square. That finally forces the queen to come to d3. And now we can play c4. We could also take the queen, but c4 is very strong. It's going to lead to checkmate because this knight takes. We can recapture with the queen and deliver checkmate. Or even prettier, recapture with the pawn. That's nasty. The pawn attacks the king. And if you look closely, it's indeed checkmate, since the queen defends and the bishop controls the dark squares. That's why after rook b6, check here, Maxime Lagarde goes to a7. But bishop d4 prepares the discovered attack. But the queen can also come in. Queen b.1. Check was played. King a3. Queen c1 check. The king escapes to b4. e5 is played to attack the bishop. And here, Vokhivov finds the fastest checkmate. By the way, what is he going to play? This is the last time I invite you to pause the video. So did you find it? There are several possible checkmates, but the fastest checkmate is in 4 coups. It consists of moving the rook back to b5. The bishop attacks. It's quite nice because the bishop is attacked by the pawn, and we move the rook back, which is also attacked by the pawn. But this will lead to checkmate, because after pawn takes, it opens up access to the c5 square. So queen to c5 check, and the king is forced to go to a8. Queen to c8 check, and the king is forced to go to a7. And we would finish with queen to b8 checkmate. What I liked about this game is both the strategic approach, how Vokhivov gradually weakened or provoked weaknesses on the opponent's dark squares, and how he did it. He managed to prevent Maxime Lagarde's knights from dominating the white squares. He was very cautious. And then once he had control over the dark squares, he was even able to sacrifice on b6. As we saw, the black king's shelter was no longer able to hold. So a beautiful game that shows both the strategic connection that leads to tactical conclusions afterwards. I hope you enjoyed it. You can leave me likes, comments, share the video, or support the channel. Goodbye, everyone.